You know, when you think about a massive system breaking down, like um, a power grid failing, or a bridge taking structural damage, or even just a hospital losing its primary generator.
Right, something fundamental.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There is usually this comforting assumption lurking in the back of your mind. You assume someone somewhere has a manual.
Oh, for sure.
You assume there are contingency plans, right? Like redundancies or a switch that automatically flips to reroute the power or the resources.
Oh, well, we all do that.
It's this incredibly clean binary engineering mindset that we all rely on to just, sleep at night. We inherently believe that humanity has built safety nets out of the same concrete and steel that we build our cities with.
Well, it is the illusion of a controlled environment. I mean,
Right.
we mentally categorize the world into two states, basically,
Yeah.
functional and non-functional.
Right.
And when something slips into that non-functional state, we just assume there's an established protocol to wrench it back. We really rarely consider what happens when the protocol itself is what burns down.
Exactly. And when you step out of the realm of standard engineering and into the reality of catastrophic disaster response, that pristine manual is just gone.
Completely gone.
The backup generator is flooded.
Mm.
The people who were supposed to pull the levers are either unreachable or, they are victims themselves.
Yeah, which happens a lot.
Suddenly, you are looking at a landscape of human survival that isn't binary at all. It is murky, it's chaotic, and terrifyingly unpredictable.
It really is.
And that is exactly what we are diving into today. For you listening, we are exploring the extreme edge of human ingenuity. How we engineer systems to save lives when literally every normal system we rely on has completely evaporated.
And to understand how we operate in that absolute dark, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today. They cover the entire timeline of a crisis.
Yeah, lay them out for us.
So first, we have a 2010 operations research paper that unpacks the highly complex mathematics of pre-positioning emergency supplies.
Which is literally calculating the unpredictable.
Exactly. Then we are looking at a 2010 clinical review that charts the history and the rather harsh algorithms of disaster triage.
Super harsh.
And finally, to see what happens when the dust settles but the system remains broken, we are analyzing a 2023 systematic literature review. It focuses on emergency care systems in post-conflict settings.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp how we handle the chaos, we have to start long before the sirens ever go off.
Right, the preparation phase.
Right. We have to start in the period of calm, which it turns out isn't calm at all. It is a period of intense, incredibly high-stakes mathematics.
Very high stakes.
Before a hurricane makes landfall, before an earthquake shatters a fault line, emergency managers don't just guess where to put the water bottles and bandages. They rely on algorithms.
They have to. The scale is just too big for guessing.
Yeah, and the operations research paper by Rawls and Turnquist gives us a window into this. They focus on hurricane threats in the Gulf Coast.
Yes, specifically the Gulf region.
And they introduce this framework called a two-stage stochastic mixed integer program. Now, I know you listening to this deep dive are familiar with mathematical modeling, so we won't get bogged down in basic definitions.
Right, we can skip the math class part.
Exactly. But the actual mechanics of this specific model, which is often abbreviated as SMIP, are just wild.
They really are, because the model is attempting to solve a paradox, basically. It has to make concrete, unchangeable decisions in the physical world based on a future that, hasn't happened yet.
Right, a future that might take 1,000 different shapes.
Exactly. The two stages are the key to understanding the mechanism here. Stage one is the reality before the event. You're sitting at a desk months before hurricane season even starts.
Okay, so total calm outside.
Yep. And you have to decide where to build or lease warehouses across 10 states. You have to decide exactly how many pallets of prepackaged meals, bottled water, and trauma kits to buy.
And where to put them.
Right, which specific warehouses get what. And these are massive, massive financial commitments.
And once you commit, that's it, right? You can't unsign the lease on a warehouse when you see the hurricane tracking a different direction on the weather radar.
No, you can't. The supplies are locked in place.
So that's stage one.
Right. And you are making these stage one decisions knowing that stage two is looming.
And stage two is the aftermath.
Yes. Stage two is the recourse. The storm has hit, the damage is done, and now you have to push whatever supplies actually survived out of those warehouses.
Which means moving them across a damaged transportation network.
Exactly. You have to get them to the people who need them. So the SMIP model evaluates your initial decisions against an array of discrete scenarios.
So it runs simulations.
But not just one simulation. It runs countless permutations of where the storm could hit, how strong it could be, and it assigns a specific mathematical probability to each one.
Wow. And here is where I want to really dig into the machinery of this, because the model is constantly fighting a war between two opposing forces, right?
Yes. Holding costs versus penalty costs.
Yeah, so let's look at holding costs first, because this is a pretty straightforward business logic. You are paying rent on a facility. You are paying for security.
You have to keep the lights on.
Exactly. And crucially, you are dealing with spoilage. I mean, prepackaged meals expire, water goes bad eventually.
Medical supplies degrade too. Bandages lose sterility.
Right. So if you stockpile $10 million worth of inventory and no disaster hits for 3 years, you are bleeding money.
You are.
The holding cost is the financial burden of over-preparing. It's like packing a survival kit for a road trip, but you don't know if you're going to the desert or the Arctic.
And there's a mathematical probability that a bear eats half your kit on day one.
Yes, exactly. But the counterbalance to that holding cost is the penalty cost. And this is where the operations research, it sort of crosses into humanitarian ethics.
It does. It gets very philosophical.
Because the penalty cost is the mathematical value assigned to unmet demand. If a community needs 5,000 trauma kits and your network can only deliver 1,000, there is a penalty for the 4,000 missing kits.
And the algorithm's overarching objective is to minimize the total expected cost across all those probability scenarios.
So it has to find this razor's edge where the financial burden of storing the gear is perfectly balanced against the devastating penalty of someone bleeding out because a bandage didn't arrive.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to push back here. How does a computer actually calculate that? It's one thing to say we balance budgets against lives, but in an algorithm, a life has to be a number.
Yes, it has to be quantified.
How do you assign a numerical penalty cost to someone not getting a medical kit? Isn't that an ethical nightmare disguised as an equation?
It is a huge ethical challenge. And what's fascinating here is how the algorithm uses a specific construct within its network flow to solve this. They call it a supersource node.
A supersource node. Okay, let's visualize this for a second. In a standard network map, you have nodes, which are the warehouses and the cities. And you have arcs, which are the highways and rail lines connecting them. So what exactly is the supersource node?
Think of it as a phantom warehouse floating above the physical map.
Okay, a phantom warehouse.
Yeah. It has an infinite supply of water, meals, and medical kits. Now, the algorithm is designed to fulfill the demand of every affected city.
Right.
First, it tried to pull supplies from the real physical warehouses along the real physical highways.
Makes sense.
But what happens if the real warehouse in New Orleans was destroyed by the very hurricane it was preparing for? The model accounts for that. It applies a variable that destroys a percentage of the pre-positioned stock based on the severity of the scenario.
Oh, wow. Or what if the warehouse survives, but the roads connecting it to the demand are washed out?
Exactly. The capacity of those highways just drops to zero.
So the physical network fails to meet the demand.
Yes. But the algorithm mathematically demands that the need is met. So it reaches up and pulls the missing supplies for the phantom supersource node.
Okay, but it can't just do that for free, right?
No, absolutely not. Whenever a unit of supply flows from that supersource node, it triggers a massive penalty cost.
How massive?
Astronomically high. The researchers set this penalty cost orders of magnitude higher than the cost of buying and storing a real bottle of water.
Ah, I see. So by making the mathematical punishment for using the phantom node so incredibly severe, the algorithm is forced to bend over backward in stage 1.
Yes. It forces the system to buy more real supplies, lease more real warehouses, and find more robust physical routes.
All to avoid ever having to trigger that supersource penalty.
Exactly. It's basically a way of tricking a cold financial equation into prioritizing human life.
That is brilliant. It guarantees that the linear programming solver will exhaust every conceivable physical option before it accepts that a demand goes unmet.
Right. It is a quantifiable framework for minimizing human suffering. But even with this elegant math, the model reveals a pretty harsh reality. It shows us that if you don't pre-position enough gear, or if your network isn't resilient enough to handle the probable destruction of its own assets, well, there is a hard limit to what you can do on the day of the disaster.
The math literally proves that you cannot improvise a logistics network while the ground is shaking.
You really can't.
If the supplies aren't there when the system breaks, no amount of heroism on the ground will materialize them out of thin air.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It is. And that hard limit, that moment when the supplies actually run out and the hospitals overflow, that pushes us from the theoretical mat of anticipation into the brutal, immediate reality of the event itself.
The day of the disaster.
Right. When the supersource node becomes a reality and you simply do not have enough medical care for the people in front of you, how do you decide who gets saved?
And that transition takes us directly into the 2010 clinical review by Dr. Christopher Lee. It's all about disaster and mass casualty triage.
Which is a heavy topic.
It is. But to understand how responders make these impossible choices, we first have to understand the specific environment they are operating in.
Okay, set the scene for us.
The literature draws a very sharp, very necessary distinction between a mass casualty incident, an MCI, and a true disaster.
We tend to use those words interchangeably in the media, don't we?
We do all the time.
Mm.
But functionally, medically, they're entirely different environments.
Right. So an MCI is essentially a localized stress test on the system. It places a massive sudden demand on medical resources.
Yes.
So imagine, for example, a multi-vehicle pileup on a major interstate, or a structural collapse at a localized building. There might be 50 or 100 severe injuries.
Which is horrific.
Horrific, yes. It requires intense coordination, and the local emergency responders will be pushed to their absolute limits. But, and this is key, the fundamental infrastructure surrounding the event is still intact.
Exactly. The neighboring counties can send ambulances.
The regional trauma centers are still operating. The system bends, but it doesn't break.
But a disaster, as defined by the World Health Organization and analyzed in this review, is a different beast entirely.
How so?
A disaster occurs when the level of destruction fundamentally exceeds the capacity of the community to respond. The system itself is part of the wreckage.
Right, like an earthquake.
Yeah, the review points to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. Hospitals themselves collapsed, taking medical staff with them and destroying the stockpiles of supplies.
That's horrifying.
It is. In a disaster, you aren't just lacking resources, you are lacking the environment in which resources function.
And in both an MCI and a disaster, the immediate mechanism for managing that chaos is triage.
Triage, yes.
Which I learned from the source comes from the French verb meaning to sort.
To sort, right.
And originally it was used to describe the sorting of agricultural products, separating the healthy crops from the damaged ones before taking them to market.
It is a bit grim when you think about it.
Applying that agricultural logic to human beings lying in the rubble of an earthquake is a chilling thought, but it is the foundation of emergency response.
And that concept of human sorting did not originate in civilian hospitals. Our modern protocols are the direct descendants of battlefield medicine.
The military origins.
Yes. The clinical review traces the origin back to 1812, to the Napoleonic Wars. Specifically, to a French military surgeon named Baron Dominique Jean Larrey.
Because before Larry, the standard operating procedure for military medicine was essentially to wait until the killing stopped, right?
Pretty much. The
Isn't that right?
surgeon stayed in the rear.
And the wounded just lay where they fell until the battle was decidedly over. If you survived the hours of bleeding in the mud, maybe someone would come for you.
Which resulted in staggering mortality rates.
So Larry looked at that and completely upended it.
He did. He invented the concept of immediate on-site triage. He deployed teams to evaluate the wounded directly on the battlefield while the fighting was still happening.
That's incredibly brave.
It was. And his rule was radical for the time. He treated the most severely wounded first, regardless of their military rank.
Right. Officers or foot soldiers, it didn't matter.
Exactly. If you were dying the fastest, you got the surgeon first.
But that philosophy of who gets treated first didn't stay static. The review highlights a major shift a few decades later in 1846.
By a British surgeon, John Wilson.
Right. Wilson looked at Larry's approach, treating the absolute worst injuries first, and realized it wasn't mathematically efficient.
Because of the time required.
Exactly. If a surgeon spends 4 hours trying to save a soldier with a catastrophic, likely fatal abdomen wound, 4 other soldiers with survivable arterial bleeds might die waiting their turn.
So Wilson argued for a different sorting method.
He said we should bypass the minor injuries, yes, but we must also bypass the most severe, near-fatal injuries. He wanted to focus entirely on the middle.
The sweet spot.
Yeah, treat the patients who are in critical danger, but who actually have a high probability of survival if given immediate care.
And that is the moment the utilitarian calculation enters the medical field. It is no longer about the individual patient lying in front of you.
It becomes about the numbers.
Right. It is about maximizing the yield of survivors. And as we move into the 20th century, specifically World War I, the United States military adopted triage protocols that further shifted this philosophy.
Based on the overarching goal of the organization.
Yes, exactly.
Right, because during WWI, the goal of the Medical Corps wasn't purely humanitarian. The goal was to win a global conflict.
They needed soldiers.
So their triage approach was heavily weighted toward returning the maximum number of soldiers to the fighting force.
Yes.
If you had a soldier with a shattered femur who would take massive surgical resources and months of rehabilitation, and you had a soldier with a shrapnel wound to the shoulder who just needed it cleaned and stitched to get back to the trench, you prioritize the shoulder wound.
You treat the patients who can hold a rifle again the fastest.
Which makes sense in a war, but it's so different from civilian life. And we see another technological shift during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, don't we?
We do. The introduction of the helicopter.
Aeromedical evacuation.
Right. It changed the environment again. The goal shifted from definitive on-scene treatment to rapid stabilization and immediate evacuation.
Scoop and run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just needed to stop the bleeding enough to get them in the air, moving them to heavily resourced mobile hospitals miles away from the front line.
Okay, here's where we need to look at the massive friction between these historical origins and what we do today. Because here's where it gets really interesting.
Go on.
The historical evolution we just mapped out is entirely military. The military triaged to maintain troop numbers. They triaged to win wars.
That was their primary metric of success.
But when a civilian paramedic arrives at a multi-car pileup or a collapsed building, their goal has nothing to do with operational efficiency or combat readiness.
No, not at all.
The civilian goal is purely to save the most lives possible. So if modern civilian emergency response is built on a foundation of military combat strategy, is that a flawed architecture?
It is a profound structural question.
Right. Given that civilian society doesn't run continuous disaster drills like the military, can we even trust that military-derived triage works for civilians in a grocery store?
The clinical review acknowledges this tension head-on. One of the glaring issues in disaster medicine is the lack of randomized, controlled clinical trials.
Because you can't run a clinical trial during an emergency.
Exactly. You cannot establish a control group during a tsunami. We simply do not have the hard, peer-reviewed data for catastrophic civilian events that we have for treating something like chronic hypertension.
So what do they do?
Therefore, civilian disaster response has had to adapt the military framework. They rely heavily on retrospective analysis and simulation. But the core philosophical shift remains the same.
Which is?
Whether you are a medic in a war zone or a paramedic at an earthquake, you have to abandon the core tenet of everyday medicine.
Everyday medicine operates on the principle of doing whatever is necessary for the individual patient in front of you.
Yes, individual care.
If someone comes into the ER in cardiac arrest, you put a team of 10 people on them, you run codes for an hour, you exhaust the pharmacy.
You do everything.
But in a disaster, if you dedicate 10 people to one patient for an hour, 20 other people will die waiting.
Exactly.
You have to pivot from individual care to population care. You have to do the greatest good for the greatest number.
And to execute that pivot, to force a responder to abandon their instinct to focus on the sickest individual, the system relies on algorithms.
To make it automatic.
Yes, it relies on strict, color-coded categorization that strips away the nuance of the injury and replaces it with a binary command.
This brings us to the actual mechanics of modern survival. The triage algorithms. Walk into any major disaster drill anywhere in the world and you will see the same 4 colors.
The universally recognized system utilizes red, yellow, green, and black tags.
Okay, let's define the parameters for each of these.
Sure. A red tag is immediate, or priority 1. These are patients with life-threatening injuries who require immediate intervention to survive.
But crucially, their injuries are deemed survivable with the resources currently available.
Yes, that caveat is important.
Then you have the yellow tag, delayed or priority 2. Their injuries are severe and they need hospital care, but they are currently stable enough that their lives are not in immediate jeopardy if they wait a few hours.
Right. They can wait for the red tags to be cleared.
The green tag is minimal or priority 3. These are often referred to as the walking wounded.
Which doesn't mean they aren't hurt.
Right. They might have lacerations or fractures, but they are fully stable and can wait extended periods for care.
And then there's the final category, the black tag.
Expectant or no priority.
These are patients who are either already deceased or who have injuries so catastrophic that survival is highly unlikely, even with optimal care.
And in a disaster setting with scarce resources, they are categorized as unsalvageable.
The clinical review spends significant time discussing the profound ethical and psychological toll of the black tag.
I can't even imagine.
A responder is trained their entire career to save lives. But in a disaster, the algorithm demands that they assess a patient who is alive, who is breathing, who might be conscious and in agony, and actively decide to walk away from them.
You literally tie a black ribbon to their wrist, and you leave them to die so you can move to the next person.
It is the human embodiment of the penalty cost we talked about in the math section.
It's brutal. How do medical professionals justify that action in the moment without completely breaking down?
Well, the source actually quotes the World Medical Association's statement on medical ethics in disasters to address this exact burden.
What does the statement say?
It provides a moral shield for the provider, asserting, and I quote, "It is unethical for a physician to persist at all costs at maintaining the life of a patient beyond hope, thereby wasting to no avail scarce resources needed elsewhere."
Wow. So the algorithm defines persistence beyond hope as an unethical act because it actively steals survival from the next person in line. To ensure responders actually follow through with these impossible decisions, they don't leave it up to the responder's judgment.
No, they can't.
They use decision trees. It's like a corporate flowchart, but the stakes are absolute. Instead of, did you reboot the router, the decision tree asks, can they wave their hand?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these algorithms are designed to remove cognitive load from a terrified, overwhelmed responder by reducing life and death to binary yes or no questions.
And the most prevalent of these flowcharts, developed in the 1980s by the Newport Beach Fire Department and Hoga Hospital in California, is called START.
Simple triage and rapid treatment.
Let's walk the listener through this flowchart.
The genius of START is its speed. It is designed so that a responder with relatively basic training can assess and categorize a patient in 60 seconds or less.
Which is incredibly fast.
It is. It relies on only 3 primary physiological observations: respiration, perfusion, and mental status. RPM.
Okay, so imagine you are the listener. You are a first responder arriving at the scene of a massive industrial explosion. There are 50 people scattered on the ground. You approach the first person.
Right.
You don't take a detailed medical history. You don't ask where it hurts. You look at the START flowchart etched in your mind. The very first question: can this person walk?
If the answer is yes, the algorithm categorizes them immediately. They are green.
You point them toward a designated safe zone and tell them to stay there.
Exactly. You have spent maybe 5 seconds on them.
You move to the next person on the ground. They cannot walk. The flowchart drops to the next level. Are they breathing?
Now, if the patient is not breathing, the algorithm allows for one single physical intervention. You reposition their head and neck to open the airway.
And if you open the airway and they are still not breathing...
The flowchart terminates. They are tagged black, expectant. You move on immediately.
But if they are breathing either initially or after you open the airway, the flowchart asks for a measurement. What is their respiratory rate? Is it over 30 breaths per minute?
If the rate is over 30, it indicates profound physiological stress, likely shock or severe hypoxia. The flowchart terminates here. They are tagged red, immediate.
Okay, what if their breathing is under 30?
You move down another level to check perfusion, how well the blood is circulating.
Yeah.
You check for a radial pulse at the wrist.
Got it. And if there is no pulse?
If there is no radial pulse, it indicates their blood pressure has plummeted dangerously low, usually from internal bleeding. Tagged red, immediate.
But if they do have a pulse, you hit the final box on the flowchart. Mental status?
Yes.
Yeah.
You give them a simple direct command, squeeze my hand, or blink your eyes twice.
And if they can't do it?
If they cannot follow the simple command, it indicates traumatic brain injury or severe shock affecting cognitive function. Tagged red, immediate.
And if they can follow the command?
If they can follow the command, they have passed all the physiological checks but cannot walk. They are tagged yellow, delayed.
It is highly effective at moving quickly, I'll give it that.
Yeah.
But the source points out a significant flaw in the START system.
Yes, it leans heavily toward being conservative, which frequently results in over-triage.
Over-triage, meaning the algorithm categorizes a patient as immediate when their actual clinical condition is only delayed.
Right, because the triggers for a red tag are so sensitive, a slightly elevated breathing rate from panic, or an inability to follow a command because of a language barrier rather than a brain injury. A large percentage of patients end up in the highest priority category.
And in a mass casualty event, over-triage is incredibly dangerous. If you tag 40 people as red when only 10 truly are, you flood the limited number of transport helicopters and trauma bays with people who could have waited.
You dilute the resources so much that the truly critical patients don't get the concentrated care they need.
It defeats the entire purpose of the sorting.
It does. Recognizing this, and noting the lack of hard scientific data validating existing systems, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention convened an expert panel.
To fix it.
Yes. They analyzed all the variations of triage and developed a new national guideline intended to refine the process. It is called SALT.
Sort, assess life-saving interventions, treatment, and transport.
Exactly.
So how does SALT change the mechanics of the flowchart to prevent that massive over-triage?
Well, it introduces nuance at the very beginning and specific actions in the middle. Step 1 of SALT is global sorting.
Okay.
Instead of walking up to patients one by one, the responder stands at the edge of the scene and uses voice commands. First, if you can hear me, walk to this area.
So those people are assessed third.
Right. Then, if you cannot walk, wave your hand, or make a purposeful movement, those people are assessed second.
And the rest?
The remaining patients, the ones lying completely still or with obvious life-threatening hemorrhage, are assessed first. It prioritizes the queue before the individual assessments even begin.
That's smart. And then during the assessment phase, SALT makes a critical divergence from START.
Yes, the L in SALT stands for life-saving interventions.
Which is huge, because the older algorithms basically told responders to keep their hands in their pockets, just observe, tag, and move.
Exactly. But SALT recognizes that a patient might die of a completely preventable issue while you are tagging the rest of the crowd.
Right.
SALT explicitly authorizes responders to take a few seconds to perform specific rapid interventions that have a massive impact on survival.
Like what?
If you see major arterial bleeding, you apply a tourniquet. You open the airway. You can perform needle decompression for a collapsed lung, or administer an auto-injector antidote if it is a chemical exposure scenario.
And you do these things before you apply the color tag.
Yes. It allows the responder to arrest the immediate cause of death without getting bogged down in complex care.
It acknowledges the reality on the ground. When adrenaline is flooding your system, when the environment is deafening, you cannot engage in complex diagnostic reasoning.
No, you absolutely cannot.
You need an algorithm that forces the math of the greatest good into a physical, repeatable routine.
Exactly.
But, as I read through these sources, I realized there's a massive unspoken assumption underpinning both the pre-positioning math and the triage flowcharts.
There is.
They all assume that at the end of the line, a hospital exists. The algorithm assumes that when you tag someone red, an ambulance arrives, drives them away from the wreckage, and delivers them to a gleaming facility with electricity, surgeons, and blood banks.
And that assumption brings us to the most complex and sobering part of our deep dive.
It really does.
What happens when the system itself is the casualty? What happens when the disaster isn't a singular event like an earthquake, but a prolonged period of destruction, like a war?
That is exactly what our third source investigates, the 2023 Systematic Literature Review by Werner and colleagues.
Focusing on emergency care systems in post-conflict settings.
Right. We are moving from the chaos of the immediate impact into the grueling, long-term reality of a society where the infrastructure has been systematically dismantled.
To structure their analysis, the researchers use the World Health Organization's Emergency Care System Framework.
Okay, let's break that down.
This framework divides emergency care into 3 distinct interdependent phases: scene, transport, and facility.
And if any one of those links breaks, the entire chain of survival fails.
Yeah, exactly. And in post-conflict states, the literature shows catastrophic failures at every single level, often compounding each other.
Let's look at the first 2 links. Scene and transport. This is the pre-hospital environment.
Right. In a stable society, this is largely invisible infrastructure. A civilian has a medical emergency, they pick up a phone, they dial a 3-digit number, a centralized dispatch center receives the call, and an ambulance is routed via GPS.
It is automatic. We don't even think about the immense technological and organizational machinery required to make that happen.
We take it for granted.
But the review highlights how fragile that machinery is. Let's talk about Kosovo.
Yes, in post-war Kosovo, researchers found that the pre-hospital system was essentially paralyzed, not just by a lack of ambulances, but by a lack of telecommunications.
The telephone network was so unreliable and degraded that citizens physically could not place a call to activate an emergency response.
The ambulance might exist, but there is no way to connect the demand to the supply.
And even if you can communicate the need, the transport infrastructure itself is often decimated. Look at the data from South Africa.
Right. Analyzing data during its transitional periods, the literature revealed that nearly half of all patients presenting with severe injuries arrived at the hospital in private vehicles, completely bypassing any formal ambulance system.
Which means there is no triage on the scene.
None.
There is no stabilization. There is no paramedic maintaining an airway or stopping bleeding during the transport.
And in Rwanda, in the years following the genocide, the systemic collapse was total. The review found that there was virtually no formal pre-hospital triage, no organized dispatch system, and no provincial emergency reporting structure whatsoever.
The infrastructure of communication had just vanished.
Entirely.
So the reality on the ground is people loading critically injured family members into the back seats of taxis or civilian cars with no medical equipment, blindly driving toward a building they merely hope is operational.
And this leads us to the third link in the WHO framework, the facility.
When these patients finally arrive at a hospital, what do they find?
According to the literature, they frequently find facilities that are completely unequipped to handle the trauma arriving at their doors.
For instance, in Afghanistan.
Yes. The review noted that while physical emergency departments exist at various district hospitals, they are predominantly staffed by general practitioners.
These are doctors trained in primary care, managing chronic illnesses and basic infections.
Exactly. They have little to no specialized training in trauma resuscitation or emergency medicine.
Furthermore, the administrators managing the hospitals have no training in patient flow or mass casualty coordination.
The facility might have walls and a roof, but the specialized human capital required to run an emergency department simply isn't there.
We see this acutely in maternal health, too.
Yes. In Liberia, following their extended civil conflicts, a comprehensive survey of 36 county-level medical facilities found a staggering statistic.
What was it?
Absolutely 0% of them provided basic emergency obstetric care. Women experiencing life-threatening complications during childbirth had no functional facility to turn to at the county level.
The physical infrastructure was just totally disconnected from the medical capability.
Exactly.
This breakdown of the facility leads into a profound epidemiological observation in the literature. When a society transitions out of conflict, the types of medical emergencies arriving at the hospital undergo a massive shift.
The burden of disease changes, but it doesn't necessarily lighten.
Right. And just as a quick note for you listening, we are going to look closely at the data presented in the review, strictly analyzing the medical epidemiology of these regions impartially. We're just reporting what the sources found.
Right, focusing purely on the medical data. The data clearly shows that the cessation of formal military hostilities does not equate to a cessation of trauma.
Right. Like in Northern Ireland.
Exactly. In Northern Ireland, researchers tracking emergency department admissions noted that paramilitary-style punishment attacks, severe beatings and shootings used for community control, continued to occur at significant rates well after formal political ceasefires were implemented.
These attacks remained a massive ongoing drain on emergency medical resources, requiring complex orthopedic and trauma care.
The emergency room data tells the story of the society.
It really does. In Kosovo, a survey conducted in emergency departments 2 years after the war concluded found that nearly 50% of the patients presenting for care exhibited symptoms consistent with clinical depression.
And 13% displayed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder.
When the primary care system and mental health infrastructure are destroyed, the emergency room becomes the default catch-all destination for the psychological aftermath of the conflict.
We see another clear shift in South Africa. Researchers analyzing trauma registries noted that as the country transitioned toward democracy, there was a measurable decline in the presentation of stab wounds at emergency departments.
However, this was simultaneously accompanied by a significant increase in gunshot wounds.
The mechanism of injury evolved as the societal structure changed.
So what does this all mean? The trauma doesn't sign a peace treaty. The transition from war to peace actually shifts the type of trauma you see in the ER rather than eliminating it.
Exactly. The conventional battlefield may quiet down, but the enduring structural violence, the mental health crises, and the total lack of preventative primary care mean that the emergency department remains a frontline battleground.
The patients just arrive with different wounds.
Which brings us to the most difficult question. How do you rebuild?
Yeah, how do you even start?
Fixing these broken systems is not simply a matter of pouring concrete, paving roads, or dropping crates of the pre-positioned supplies we talked about earlier.
Right, it's not a stage 1 logistics problem anymore.
No. Rebuilding an emergency care system in a post-conflict state is fundamentally an exercise in repairing human trust and optimizing heavily fragmented resources.
Trust is actually highlighted in the literature as an invisible but vital piece of medical infrastructure. If the population doesn't trust the hospital cannot function.
Right. Look at post-war Kosovo again. The review details how lingering societal and ethnic divisions acted as a massive barrier to care.
Opposing ethnic groups actively avoided hospitals that were staffed or run by their historical opponents.
The data showed that patients would intentionally seek care at private, often lesser-equipped clinics run by individuals of their own ethnicity, rather than utilize a better-resourced public hospital associated with the opposing group.
The social fracture directly overrides the medical necessity, and when people do not trust the primary health institutions, they delay seeking care until their condition becomes catastrophic.
Which places an even greater burden on the crippled emergency system.
And then there's the issue of competence. We discussed the general practitioners in Afghanistan and the lack of obstetric care in Liberia.
Yes, and the literature points to a terrifying paradox regarding medical training in these environments.
Which is that incompetent care can mathematically be more lethal than no care at all.
It is a counterintuitive concept, but the data supports it. The review cites a qualitative analysis conducted in South Sudan focusing on maternal mortality.
They specifically looked at the third delay, which is the delay in receiving adequate, appropriate care once a patient has actually managed to reach a medical facility.
And the study concluded that outcomes for women suffering from emergency obstetric complications were measurably better when no provider was available, compared to when they were treated by an incompetent or untrained provider.
How does the physiology of that work? Why is bad care worse than just being left alone?
Because a non-competent provider is highly likely to perform an incorrect fatal intervention.
Oh, I see.
They might administer the wrong medication that induces deadly hemorrhaging or perform a surgical maneuver they aren't trained for, causing catastrophic internal damage.
Furthermore, the presence of a doctor, even an untrained one, provides a false sense of security to the family, doesn't it?
It does. It prevents the family from making the difficult decision to attempt transport to a higher-level facility further away.
Conversely, a woman with no provider might rely on natural physiological processes or traditional community knowledge, which the data suggests is statistically less harmful than a botched medical intervention.
Actively visiting a non-functioning facility places the patient at a higher statistical risk of death.
It is a devastating reality, but the literature review does not stop at diagnosing the failures. It pivots to highlight interventions that have actually proven effective in these incredibly constrained environments.
It focuses on pragmatic, context-specific solutions that don't rely on building a billion-dollar hospital, but rather on optimizing what exists.
A prime example of addressing the trust deficit is found in Afghanistan. The review highlights the implementation of community scorecards.
Yes.
How exactly does a scorecard rebuild trust in a healthcare system? I mean, it sounds like filling out a survey at a restaurant.
Well, it is a mechanism of social accountability. The scorecard isn't just a survey, it is a participatory tool.
How so?
Members of the community and the healthcare providers independently rate the quality, accessibility, and reliability of the local health services.
Okay.
Then, and this is the crucial part, both groups are brought together in a facilitated forum to discuss the discrepancies in their scores.
Oh, wow. So it forces dialogue.
Yes, it allows the community to voice exactly why they feel alienated, and it allows the providers to explain the logistical constraints they are under.
And the data shows this collaborative process actively repairs mutual trust and leads to community-driven solutions that actually fit the local context.
The review also looks at how to address the lack of triage in facilities. In Somaliland, they faced a severely under-resourced district hospital with no sorting mechanism.
So what did they do?
Rather than trying to invent a completely new triage algorithm from scratch or imposing a complex Western model, they imported the existing South African triage score, or SATs.
They trained the local nursing staff on it, and the data showed that the staff were able to use it accurately and sustainably.
It proved that robust existing protocols from other developing regions can be successfully adapted to post-conflict environments, providing immediate structure to the chaos.
We also see targeted training yielding immense results. On the border between Thailand and Myanmar, an area plagued by long-term conflict and displacement, organizations implemented advanced life support in obstetrics known as ALSO.
Alongside basic life support training for local birth attendants.
And what are the mechanics of that training? What are they actually doing that saves lives in a clinic with limited power?
They are training providers in specific manual interventions to manage postpartum hemorrhage, which is a leading cause of maternal death.
Okay.
This includes techniques like bimanual uterine compression, properly administering uterotonic drugs if available, and recognizing the early physiological signs of shock before it becomes irreversible.
The outcome data demonstrated that these specific targeted trainings were highly beneficial and actively reduced the incidence of fatal hemorrhaging.
The final intervention the review highlights is in Nagorno-Karabakh, where they implemented first aid training for primary care providers, those general practitioners we discussed earlier who lacked trauma experience.
And how did that go?
The immediate feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The providers recognized the critical importance of the skills for stabilizing trauma patients. However, the study tracked the data over time and noted a critical caveat.
Which was?
Technical knowledge retention was only modest a few months later.
Right. It highlights a fundamental law of emergency medicine. Skills decay.
Yes, they do.
You cannot conduct a single weekend seminar on trauma resuscitation and expect a general practitioner to flawlessly execute a chest decompression a year later.
The intervention is only valid if it includes continuous, mandatory refresher courses to maintain the muscle memory and cognitive recall.
So we have the roadmap. The literature provides hard evidence that specific, targeted interventions work. We know that implementing community scorecards, adapting regional triage systems like S8S, conducting focused obstetric training, and providing continuous first aid refreshers actively save lives in shattered environments.
The mechanics of the solution are known.
Which raises a massive, almost uncomfortable question. If the global health community knows exactly how to fix these frontline emergency care systems, why are they still failing so spectacularly?
The researchers address this by pointing to a structural flaw in how global health is financed. There is a staggering disparity in funding.
Explain that.
Money for broad foundational emergency care systems is incredibly sparse. Instead, international donor money overwhelmingly favors what are known as vertical disease programs.
Vertical program.
Yes, these are highly siloed initiatives focused entirely on eradicating or managing a single, specific disease, predominantly HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria.
And to be clear, those are devastating diseases that absolutely require massive global funding and attention.
Without question. But the literature argues that this single-minded focus creates a dangerous imbalance.
Because it ignores the foundation.
Exactly. Investing in horizontal infrastructure, a generalized, resilient frontline emergency care system creates a safety net capable of handling everything.
A functional ER can treat a malaria complication, a gunshot wound, a complicated childbirth, and a severe asthma attack.
The researchers estimate that properly funding these horizontal emergency systems globally could save over 400,000 lives every single year.
So why do the global funders prefer the vertical model?
It fundamentally comes down to metrics and the desire for clean data. Vertical programs offer easily quantifiable results that look great on an annual report to donors.
Ah, I see.
You can easily count the exact number of malaria nets distributed or the number of antiretroviral pill bottles dispensed. The cause and effect are linear.
But horizontal systems are messy. It is incredibly difficult to mathematically prove that a newly organized dispatch center or a well-trained triage nurse who correctly sorted 50 patients directly resulted in a specific number of lives saved.
Funders shy away from the complex, unglamorous work of building generalized infrastructure because the return on investment is harder to put on a spreadsheet.
And that prioritization leaves the people on the ground entirely vulnerable to anything outside that specific silo. I want you, the listener, to try an exercise right now to really internalize what this means.
It's a powerful exercise.
Think about your own local emergency room, the one you drive past in your town. Picture the automatic sliding doors, the brightly lit intake desk, the specialized trauma bays. Now, start dismantling it in your mind.
Strip away the ambulance network that brings the patients there. The roads are blocked. The phones are dead.
Remove the specialized emergency physicians and trauma surgeons and replace them with a single primary care doctor who has never treated a crush injury.
Take away the global funding, the reliable electricity, the cardiac monitors, and the blood bank.
And finally, strip away the invisible infrastructure, your own innate trust that the institution itself is capable of or even interested in saving your life. What exactly are you left with?
You are left with the daily reality for millions of people navigating post-conflict zones. You're left with a void where a system should be, a reality where human survival is dictated almost entirely by luck, geographic proximity to a willing bystander, and the desperate improvisation of community abandoned by the larger global architecture.
It is a heavy, incredibly complex journey we have taken today, but an essential one for understanding the fragility of the safety nets we take for granted. Let's trace the arc of what we've uncovered.
Right, let's recap.
We started in the abstract, highly controlled world of operations research, decoding the two-stage stochastic mixed integer program. We saw how emergency managers attempt to calculate the unpredictable, wrestling with the financial reality of holding costs while utilizing phantom supersource nodes.
To force an algorithm to respect the staggering penalty cost of human suffering.
We learned that true preparation requires immense financial commitment before the sky ever turns dark.
We then follow the timeline into the chaos of the disaster itself. We examine the stark difference between an MCI and a disaster, and trace the evolution of triage from the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars under Baron Larry.
Through the utilitarian shifts of World War I to the modern algorithms of start and salt.
We explored the terrifying necessity of the color-coded tags, specifically the ethical burden of the black tag, the mandate to walk away from the dying in order to protect the living.
And finally, we confronted the reality of what happens when the infrastructure itself is destroyed. Using the WHO framework, we saw how scene, transport, and facility systems collapse in post-conflict states.
We analyzed the shifting burden of trauma, the lethal danger of incompetent care, and the specific horizontal interventions required to rebuild trust and competence in the ruins.
Despite the massive disparities in global health funding,
Which leaves us with a final concept to mull over. We have seen how military triage evolved to optimize combat effectiveness, and how civilian triage evolved to do the most good for the most people in acute localized events.
Right.
But if we look toward the horizon, the nature of disasters is changing. Climate change, resource scarcity, and global instability are creating scenarios where disasters are no longer rare, isolated events.
we are facing a future of overlapping continuous crises, what some call polycrises.
If the systems are permanently overwhelmed, if the disaster is constant rather than exceptional, what will be the driving philosophy of the next triage algorithm?
Will the operations research merge with the clinical algorithms? Will we reach a point where we have to mathematically pre-position not just the water and the trauma kits, but decide years in advance which cities, which populations, or which nodes on the map are mathematically viable to save?
It is a sobering thought.
It brings us right back to our original thought. We love the comfort of manuals and clean engineering. But when the systems break down, the safety net isn't made of concrete. It is made of brutal choices, imperfect math, and the desperate hope that we can sort the chaos before it consumes us. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. We will see you next time.